Shadow Slave. By Guiltythree. Chapter 1275, Last Resort. Everything that needed to be said had already been said. Everything that needed to be done had already been done. Granted, there was not much to these preparations. Sunny and Nephi's were in a desperate situation, and they could only escape it by resorting to desperate means. This was going to be it. They were either going to live or die. Sunny looked at the weathered surface of the black turtle's shell as they walked to the shore. The black rock, the green moss, the deep fissures with murky water glistening in some of them. He had spent the first month of the nightmare here. It was a harrowing place, or rather, it was supposed to be harrowing. But, strangely, all he could remember about the Dark Island were happy memories. Training with Nephi's until sweat covered their bodies and a pleasant fatigue settled in their muscles. Laying on the moss and staring at the dreamlike sky, unbothered by the movements of the world. Eating delicious meals and drinking cool, sweet water. Bathing in the warmth of a campfire as they talked to each other, surrounded by darkness. All of that was coming to an end. It already had. He was reluctant to let go of this harrowing paradise. But there was no other choice. Maybe I truly am mad. Sunny had entered the nightmare utterly crushed. From Falcon Scott to the Battle of the Black Skull, he had tasted nothing but bitter failure. He had wished to be strong. He had made this wish come true, only to find out that it was of no use in the end. As if to mock him, fate had obliterated everything. However, somehow, he had truly been content on the Dark Island. Sailing through a river of unholy blood on the corpse of a dreadful monster, being pulled into the past by the current, he had been happy on that journey, and happier still to share it with someone he was fond of. Was fond of so much. He had been having fun in the depths of a nightmare. So what if I'm mad? He would need madness to survive today. The three of them, Sunny, and Nephi's, and Saint, reached the slope of the island. Below them, the great river was flowing endlessly, bleak because of the encroaching night. The darkest hour, the brief time after the suns had already plunged into the river but before the vast expanse of clear water started to glow with soft radiance, was swiftly approaching. Sunny took a deep breath. Calm down. You've prepared for this. You've been preparing this whole time. Indeed, Sunny had not spent the whole month simply relaxing and spending idle time with Nephi's. He had always known that this unexpected respite was not meant to last. And so, he had been studying the Azure Serpent. By now, Sunny knew the mad beast much better than he knew most people. He had learned everything about it, how the serpent fought, how the serpent thought. What emotions guided it, what dark passion burned in its vile, corrupted soul. He also learned how the creature's colossal body moved and worked, down to the smallest detail, as well as how the great river serpent commanded water to turn it into a weapon. In that regard, Sunny's experience fighting side by side with the scions of the House of Night had been of great help. After coming to learn all these things, Sunny knew for a fact that he would never be able to defeat the Azure Serpent in a battle. But that was if the Azure Serpent was healthy and whole. It was not anymore. The great beast had been ravaged by the battles with the dark butterfly, the harrowing assaults of the krill swarms, and the insidious attacks of the marauding abominations. Its flesh was shredded and frayed, its strength was exhausted, and its mind was clouded by rampant madness. So, maybe, just maybe, Sunny stood a chance of emerging victorious from the fight. If he won, they would have to leave the Dark Island immediately and never look back. Otherwise, the monstrous butterfly was going to descend from the dark sky, notice them, and devour them. If he lost, he would die. At least he would die first, turning the words the Sin of Solace had whispered once into a lie. I'm ready. With a sigh, Sunny turned to Nephi's and offered her a faint smile. He lingered for a few moments, then said evenly, the next one is on you. She nodded seriously, completely missing the humorous undertone. Of course. Sunny shook his head, then took her hand, transferring the essence pearl from his soul into hers. I was joking, you know. Nephi's lingered for a moment. Suddenly, she gripped his hand tighter and looked him straight in the eyes. I wasn't. He held her gaze for several long, poignant seconds before freeing his hand with a sigh. Then, Sunny glanced at Saint. You know what to do. The graceful knight raised her bow with indifferent grace. She had to play an important part in the battle, too. Nephi's might not have been able to augment her with the white flames, but Saint had been wearing the stifled scream for an entire month. Better yet, just as Sunny had thought, sailing on the great river had a strange effect on the transcendent charm. By now, the enhancement it gifted to the taciturn shadow was much greater than it was supposed to be. Even without the augmentation of the shadow flame, she was frighteningly powerful. Finally, Sunny looked back at Nephi's. Do it. He felt the purifying warmth flowing into his body and soul, strengthening both. At the same time, all 5 of his shadows wrapped themselves around him. In an instant, Sunny felt strong enough to crush the black rocks with his bare fists, and shake the entire world with his steps. Turning to the great river, he took a deep breath and whispered. Lost from light. Remember. This is your name. Then, he opened the gate of the shadow lantern and allowed a flood of shadows to flow out of it, drowning the slopes of the island. They flowed down like an avalanche of darkness, eventually touching the water. Sunny closed his eyes and dissolved into the shadows. In the next moment, the shadows moved, and something tore free from their dark embrace. A giant serpent with scales as black as onyx manifested itself from the darkness and dove into the water with a deafening roar. Chapter 1276, Dance of Monsters. Sunny was ready for battle. Now. He wasn't Sunny anymore. He was a mighty serpent, clad in an armor of onyx scales, with fangs as sharp as diamonds and enough fury to incinerate the world. But that was not enough. Following his wrathful roar, the shell hiding below his scales turned into the adamantine mantle. A fearsome obsidian armor encased his flexible body, light as a feather and crafted so intricately as not to restrict his movement in any way. The water exploded into the air when he dove into the depths. The depths that belonged to him, and him alone. Old Snake. The call escaped his monstrous maw, turned into a senseless roar. What he had done was simple, but also indescribably hard. He had dove deeper into shadow dance than ever before, mirroring both the mind and the physique of a nightmare creature. He had not been sure that it would be possible until the last moment, but his meticulous preparation paid off. It was do or die, nothing less. He had spent countless hours observing the azure serpent and learning everything there was to learn about it. Then, he dissolved into the shadows, and manifested himself back into a tangible form. Finally, he summoned the dead shadow of the black turtle, which he had lured into the lantern, to form a mighty shell around his fragile incarnation. But, for the first time, the shape of his shell was not that of the shadow fiend. Instead, it was the shape of a monstrous river serpent. The shape of the mad beast whom he feared, admired, and wanted to kill. Of course, this shadow shell could not compare to the real thing. He was only an ascended, after all, while the azure serpent was a great beast. It was weaker, less resilient, and smaller, maybe a quarter of the size of the actual abomination. However, it was suffused with the power of both shadows and soul flame, granting it power well beyond the limits of what an ascended could possess. It was also protected by the mantle, and made to reign the depths. Only. There was another challenging his reign. A maddening fury consumed his mind, and he shot forward through the water like a black spear. He could feel it. The scent of blood spilling from the mangled body of the older, stronger beast. So what if it was older? So what if it was stronger? It would be torn apart by his fangs, anyway. The azure serpent had felt him, too. He sensed a vast shadow rising from below to meet him. It was brimming with harrowing power and terrifying madness. But he was not afraid. He didn't know how to be afraid. All he knew was wrath and bloodlust. The two of them, a colossal serpent covered in beautiful azure scales and a smaller serpent encased in obsidian armor, wreathed in shadows and blinding white radiance, collided in the water, causing gargantuan waves to rise on the surface of the great river. Their first collision would have been his last if he had not twisted his body at the last moment, evading the azure serpent's deadly maw and diving under its belly. He had to remind himself that he was lost from light. He was not a mindless nightmare creature. He was not a beast. He was cunning, resourceful, and skilled. He possessed the honed battle sense of a masterful warrior and the powerful soul of a tyrant. It was a strange thing, to both believe that he was a serpent with all his heart and know that he was something else. Losing himself in the dance was just too easy. But his true name was like a beacon that guided him home. Sunny. Understood that he had to remember himself if he wanted to survive. His current form was immensely powerful, no less powerful than a saint's transcendent form would have been, perhaps. He could feel the barriers that had been preventing him from mastering the fourth step of shadow dance breaking. He could feel his boundless, bestial strength. But, in front of the Azure Serpent, that strength was almost laughable. Despite the terrible wounds covering the body of the great beast, it was still infinitely more powerful than his. Which was why he had to be devious, cunning, and sober if he wanted to kill his enemy. He had to be deranged and overcome by fury, too. He had to guide his mad fury and sharpen it into a cold and merciless blade. Sunny twisted his serpentine body, dodging the maw of the ancient abomination, and sunk his fangs into an open wound on the Azure Serpent's neck. It was only for a moment, though, giving up on tearing out a chunk of flesh, he let go and darted upward a split second later. It was just in time, because the Leviathan's jaws snapped closed just a meter behind him in the next moment. The two of them clashed furiously as they ascended from the depths. The Azure Serpent was much larger, more powerful, and terrifyingly domineering. The Black Serpent was smaller and more nimble, circling around the dreadful beast and delivering vicious bites one after another. However, even without being caught in the Leviathan's jaws, Sunny was suffering tremendous harm. As their bodies brushed against each other, a vast stretch of the mantle cracked and shattered. The shadows below rippled, the internal structure of the shell twisting and breaking apart. The violent currents created by the passing of the Azure Serpent's body were slowing him down, and his dark flesh was sliced open by the creature's dorsal fin. His shell was bleeding shadows. His essence was being burned. His mind was drowning in pain and derangement. More. 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 Despite knowing that it would cost him his life, Sunny felt compelled to bite into the enemy's flesh and never let go, to hurt the foe as much as he could, even if it meant death. To rip apart. To devour. To destroy. Instead, he continued to dodge the attacks of the Azure Serpent with clarity and skill, all the while attacking with hatred and fury when he could. And, all along, he was leading the great beast upward. Finally, they broke the surface and clashed again above the water. The suns were gone, and the river had not started glowing yet. The shaking world was dark. With a stifled roar, Sunny dodged the fangs of the Azure Serpent and tried to bite into an open wound on its mangled body, where white bone could be seen. However, before he could, the mad beast's tail crashed into him like an obliterating ram, sending fragments of the mantle flying through the air and a blinding flash of pain piercing in his soul. Arg! Sunny fell heavily into the water, and a tall fountain of white foam rose into the sky. The Azure Serpent let out a demented growl and lunged at him, aiming to bite the hateful worm in half. Before he could, however, 2 arrows, one black, one white, fell from the darkness and pierced its flesh. Saint and Nephi's had joined the battle.